Thank you very much, Jamie, for this interview. It's very useful for us to have your answers in some very broad and general questions, but we are interested to link in some way your work about neoliberalism and our concerns about the urban question, the urban form, the urban transformations, and the territorial challenges. So, well, the first question that I would like to ask you is, in a very broad sense, which are the characteristics of this current process of neoliberalism in terms of what you and other authors called the really existence of neoliberalisms in different contexts, no? Not like a general process, a global process as a unique thing, but with different forms in different contexts.
Our work on neoliberalism has emphasized the fact that there's a persistent tension between the utopian vision of neoliberal ideology and the practical realities of actually existing neoliberalisms in different locations. So as I think the people of Chile understand as well as anyone in the world, neoliberalism's initial emergence was a multipolar process. In many respects, the experiments designed in Chicago were enacted and learned from a Chilean a theatre of application. And so from the very earliest development of neoliberal practices as state strategies, this was a multipolar, interdependent process. I think it's also important to emphasize that actually existing neoliberalisms, as we've come to call them in the literature, are always context specific. So what is generic about neoliberalization as a process is it licenses a certain set of strategies of state and social transformation. But the terrain in which those strategies are enacted is highly differentiated, and the targets for neoliberal reform, therefore, are rather different in one location as to another. An example I often point to is that of privatization as a strategy. Conditions in the United Kingdom in the 1970s presented the Thatcher governments with a particular set of opportunities for privatization because there are large numbers of publicly owned industries and enterprises in coal mining, electricity, gas, and so forth. Those opportunities for privatization didn't exist in the United States because they'd never been taken into public ownership. So even though strategies like privatization may be used in many different contexts, the theatre of application varies quite significantly. Therefore, the front line of neoliberal reform will be different in Chile, in China, in France, in the United States, and so on. So this is why we need to think of neoliberalization as this complex, multipolar process, which has across which there are connections, but always contextual specificities. And so this means, I think, for geographers, urban planners, sociologists, many of those that have done the original work on neoliberalism, it's important to maintain a continuous dialogue between studies which are locally specific and which refer to what we have called family resemblances or broad patterns of transformation, which are echoed across cases, even if they're never repeated. And a final point I'd make is that we shouldn't expect even generalized, you might even say globalized processes of neoliberalism will ever produce uniform outcomes. It is in its nature an uneven process that operates across an uneven terrain and produces yet more uneven outcomes. So the process is always geographically specific, and in this context the situation of cities in particular, often where we see kind of flashpoints of neoliberal experimentation and resistance to those strategies.
Okay, and regarding this specificity, you also mentioned that maybe one of these particularities of the current process of neoliberalism have to do with the capture of the state, or the relationship with the state of the market, in comparison maybe with a traditional liberalism. No, so what can you maybe explain about that? How it works, this capture of the state, and maybe also in different scales. No, at a national scale, at a supranational scale, at a urban scale, or what could you say about that?
Okay. Yes, I think it's also important to recognise that strategies of neoliberal transformation are nearly always authored and authorised by states. States are typically the central actors in processes of neoliberalisation, even though the discourse of neoliberalism is about the free individual and free markets and so on. This is one of the many ways in which there's a discrepancy between the rhetoric of neoliberal reform and the reality of neoliberal programs, which invariably centrally turn on the changing functions, reach and activities of the state. So rather than producing in a simple way a shrunken or smaller state, what neoliberal reforms typically tend to do is to restructure the state apparatus to different ends. So there are qualitative changes to the organisation of the state authorised by neoliberal strategies. And to borrow a phrase from Pierre Bourdieu, they very often imply a shrinking of what Bourdieu called the left arm of the state, its social and caring functions, the delivery of social services, but an expansion of the right arm of the state associated with military expenditures, policing and discipline, social control and so forth. And in the United States in particular, you can see this very clearly with a simultaneous contraction of welfare functions and the expansion of mass incarceration as an alternative means of controlling poverty through its criminalisation. So once again, I mean, this echoes the point about the need for contextual understandings of neoliberalisation, because these strategies are enacted in the context of state architectures, hierarchies and structures which are widely differentiated. So the way in which neoliberalisation strategies and processes work in Europe, for example, where you have a European tier of government, nation states, different degrees of devolution to regions and to cities, the positioning of neoliberal reforms and their reverberation through those different scales of government and governance vary significantly from case to case. So we shouldn't expect, I don't think, a kind of template version of neoliberalisation that will be repeated case after case. But we can, I think, draw some general conclusions about the reorganised scale of relations associated with neoliberalism when we look across many cases. The general pattern, I would argue, is that there is amongst the higher scaled tiers of the state, at the transnational scale, there's often at that tier of government power without responsibility. So considerable power wielded by the World Bank and IMF, for example, without the burden of electoral responsibility. At the local scale, in contrast, city governments often have responsibility but without power. So they are expected to maintain services for local residents. They're responsible for the economic climate of the city and many other things, while often lacking the sufficient capacity to deliver those services, to deliver growth in a particular region and so on. So it's often the case that city administrations are over-responsibilised given their limited capacities, while at the higher tiers we see power without political responsibility.
Okay, and again, about scale and the urban context. You have been studying Detroit as a process of neoliberalism and restructuring after the crisis, and my question now have to do with what do you think about the capacity of cities or the capacity of administrations, local administrations, to deal with the crisis in terms of autonomy, or if it's better to be articulated with the broader scales. No? So, because, for example, here in Chile, the local government has very little power in terms of services or to manage that kind of things. It's a very centralized state. So, if we can say something about that, it's better or worse to be more or less autonomous in terms of fight against the crisis?
That's a great question, but also a complex one. I think for reasons of, I think there are political reasons for pushing for higher degrees of autonomy at the local scale, so local government can reflect the interests and needs of local populations. However, where autonomy is granted without sufficient capacity to raise taxes, to enact programs, that can often produce a simple devolution of discipline and austerity, as we see in the case of other relatively centralized systems like the United Kingdom, where local government there has very limited tax-raising powers, and much of the burden of adjustment and restructuring has been pushed from central to local government in that context. In the United States, in contrast, you have a highly devolved pattern of governance. It's a federal system with relatively weak powers at the federal level, strong powers accumulated at the state level, and rather weakened capacities at the city level. So in each of those cases, I think again, the distribution of power across scale varies between in different contexts. And what we see in many systems is struggles over the distribution of power and control between different scales of government. Downloading of risk and responsibility being a common strategy of neoliberal administrations at the national scale. I think that's a common dynamic, which you would see in both decentralized and centralized systems, that there's a deferral of the costs and risks of economic restructuring to the lower scales of government, rather than their empowerment. And I think we can certainly imagine situations in which local administrations are given increased capacities to experiment with new programs and so on, in the context of a more supportive arrangement. I think it's perhaps unlikely now that we'll move back to a Keynesian model of high levels of redistribution between tiers of government and from relatively rich to poorer regions and cities. But even if we're not going to return in the short term to that kind of high level of redistribution, there seems to be other arguments in favour of the supporting the capacities of local administrations to experiment, develop new programs, to draw on local innovations and so on, and to provide support for spreading those positive initiatives from one region to another. There's not too much of those examples around the world at the present time, but I think that will be a different kind of more progressive settlement, if you like, or a scalar settlement, where the national government would support experimentation and learning at the local level, rather than simply using financial and other measures to discipline local administrations.
Okay, and the final question now have to do with what do you think about the alternatives, or what Neil Smith said in a book from a few years ago, that the neoliberalism still exists but is dead. So what's your impression about the alternatives to that process, if there are some, and in the same way, what's your impression about Chile and Santiago in particular in this context?
Yeah, Neil Smith's famous characterization straight after the Wall Street crash was that neoliberalism was dead but dominant, and that a number of us had used the metaphor of the zombie to describe a phase of neoliberalization after the 2008 crash in the United States, where some of the higher mental functions of the neoliberal project had been impaired. Its intellectual rationales had been discredited. Its capacity for moral leadership and claiming the high ground also seemed to have been brought into question. Yet, nevertheless, neoliberalism remained the dominant hegemonic system, even though it had lost much of its legitimacy and credibility. And my sense is that it remained the dominant system because of the lack of alternatives ready to displace it, the lack of sufficiently well-organized counter-hegemonic programs and strategies to displace neoliberalism during its moment of weakness. We've since seen post-2008 neoliberalism being reasserted in some respects in a more aggressive form than prior to the crisis. More financial discipline, more imposition of austerity, and so on. In some respects, a cruder, more brutal form of neoliberalism has been reimposed. So this raises a question, I think, about the evolutionary character of neoliberalism as an historical system. It's clearly very different in its emphases, targets, and so on today as it compared to the 1970s and 80s, when Chile, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, a few countries started to experiment with neoliberal projects on a large scale. Now we're in a context in which there are impulses of neoliberalism in contexts as diverse as Eastern Europe and China and elsewhere. So it's now much more kind of widely generalized. It's deeply embedded and interpenetrated with other forms of political and social power in many different contexts. And so I think neoliberalism now exists in this highly hybridized, complex form where it coexists with other forms of social power, usually elite-oriented forms of social power, whose interests are in maintaining their social power. So one of the reasons for neoliberalism's reboot, if you like, after 2008 was that it reflected the strong positions of financial and other elites, which were largely untroubled by the crisis. The pain of the crisis was mainly felt by the 99%, or certainly the bottom 40% of society suffered much of the cost of the crisis. The top 1% were largely insulated from it and in fact have continued to benefit. And many political systems around the world reflect those most powerful and entrenched interests. So I think when we start to imagine the circumstances in which neoliberalism or the grip of neoliberalism might be eclipsed, we have to think about the capacity of counter-hegemonic forces to really contest that centralized form of power, elite, consolidated form of power. At the moment, it's been described as alternatives to neoliberalism have been described as a global social movement in fragments. I think that's an apt illustration. There are many alternatives to neoliberalism in many different parts of the world. They are not coordinated into a single strategy that challenges neoliberalism on a global scale. But we see instead multiple diverse challenges to neoliberal rule. And my sense is that the way in which neoliberalism will be eventually eclipsed is unlikely to be now some big bang confrontation between a global neoliberalism and a global alternative, but instead the progressive exhaustion of neoliberal capacities and those being exceeded by alternative social forms in many different places. So neoliberalism may not be replaced by a single other, but perhaps by many hundreds of others being incubated in many parts of the world. And if I were to look to a world region that is more than usually productive of those alternative arrangements, it will be Latin America. I think Latin America is currently the crucible for the development of many alternative, both reformist and more radical alternatives to neoliberal rule. And is producing those alternatives from participatory budgeting to new approaches to social policy, for example. It's producing those at a more rapid rate than other regions which are, I think, less likely to lead the post-neoliberal phase of development. So Latin America and perhaps Chile in particular, but I think many Latin American countries have been for the last 20 years now central region of innovation and development of alternative forms. None of us know the future, of course, and we can't exactly predict how this will roll out. But I think what we know, and this was a lesson we can learn from Milton Friedman and the other neoliberals, when they were isolated in the 1950s and 1960s and couldn't imagine a time when what they interpreted as aggravated statism would ever pass. They thought the world was trending towards a socialist future, a statist future. When they were the minority and isolated, they argued that they needed to develop ideas and to have them ready for when the time presented itself that they could put them to work, to prepare alternative strategies, alternative programs, and put them to work when opportunity presented itself. For the neoliberals, those opportunities were presented in the 1970s, in the violent overthrow of certain political regimes, not least in Latin America, and with the stagflation crisis in the global north. That provided multiple openings for the insertion of neoliberal strategies. I think now we're at 40, 50 years later, we're at a moment where it's neoliberalism which is the dominant global force, but is also reaching many of its social, technical and institutional limits. And so I think it's very important for those who wish to see alternatives to develop to neoliberalism, to have their ideas, programs and so on ready and waiting for the moment of application. I suspect those moments will arise in many different parts of the world at different times, and so it's not likely to be a single global opening, but many localized windows of opportunity will open where little and larger victories may be won against what I would characterize as a degrading system of neoliberal rule.
Okay, Jamie, thank you very much for this.
Thank you. Let me just say thanks for the opportunity to visit the centre. It's been inspiring to hear of the work that's been conducted here, especially those of us who work in a interdisciplinary or post-disciplinary way, to see the many collaborations and connections being made across the social sciences, across different traditions of analysis and so on. Extremely promising projects are being launched here at the centre, and I look forward to seeing the work that we produced here in the future.